Story 1: The Basement Tenant. I never thought I'd be the type to own a home, especially not one with so much character. But when I hit my mid-30s and found myself with an unexpected inheritance from my grandfather, it suddenly seemed possible. The real estate market was garbage in the city, so I started looking further out. That's how I ended up with 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and 2 acres of land in rural Ohio for less than what a 1-bedroom apartment would cost back home. The first time I drove up the gravel driveway to the old farmhouse, I thought I'd struck gold. Sure, the white paint was peeling, the porch sagged slightly, and the garden was overgrown, but I could see the potential. The real estate agent, Nora, seemed eager, too eager I realize now, to close the deal. She kept emphasizing how the previous owners had to relocate quickly for work and were motivated sellers. I should have asked more questions. The first night in my new home, I convinced myself the strange noises were just the house settling. Old houses make noise. Everyone knows that. The second night, I blamed it on raccoons or maybe the wind. By the third night, I couldn't ignore the distinct sound of movement coming from beneath my feet. I called a pest control company, thinking I had mice or maybe even rats. The technician spent 2 hours inspecting the house, focusing on the basement. He found nothing, no droppings, no nests, no signs of rodents at all. As he was packing up to leave, he paused. "You live here alone?" he asked. When I nodded, he frowned. "Maybe get a security system. Just a thought." That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every groan of the old house had me sitting upright in bed. Around 3 a.m., I heard what sounded unmistakably like footsteps. Not the scurrying of small animals, but the deliberate footfalls of someone trying to move quietly. The next day, I installed security cameras, 1 in the living room, 1 in the kitchen, 1 pointed at the front door, and 2 in the basement. I set them up to send alerts to my phone if they detected movement. At 2:17 a.m., my phone lit up. Motion detected. Basement camera 1. My hands shook as I opened the app. The night vision showed the concrete floor and walls of my basement, the old washing machine, some storage boxes I hadn't unpacked yet. First, I saw nothing unusual. Then a shadow moved across the wall, too large to be a mouse, too shaped like a person to be anything else. I called the police. They arrived 20 minutes later, 2 officers who looked tired and slightly annoyed. They did a thorough search of the house and found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence anyone had been there besides me. One of them suggested it might have been the shadow of a tree branch moving outside a window. The basement doesn't have windows. After they left, I couldn't bring myself to go back to bed. I sat in the kitchen with all the lights on, scrolling through neighborhood forums on my phone. That's when I found the first mention of my address in a post from 3 years earlier. "Anyone know what happened to the people at 1478 Willow Creek Road? They just disappeared overnight." The responses were vague. Someone thought they'd moved out west. Another person mentioned family troubles. One comment stood out. "Some houses in this area have bad energy. Best not to ask too many questions." The next day, I met my closest neighbor, an elderly man named Frank who lived half a mile down the road. When I mentioned my address, his friendly demeanor shifted subtly. "That old Harper place," he said, nodding. "Been through a few owners since the Harpers left in '92. "Do you know anything about the last owners?" I asked. "The real estate agent said they left suddenly." Frank's eyes darted away. "Can't say I knew them well. Kept to themselves." He changed the subject to the weather, and I couldn't get him back on topic. That night, food went missing from my kitchen. Not much, some bread, an apple, a chunk of cheese, but I knew I hadn't eaten it. The security cameras showed nothing. It was as if the food had vanished between camera angles. I began keeping a log. Footsteps at night. Missing food. Sometimes I'd find things moved slightly. A book not where I left it. A chair pulled out from the table. The cameras occasionally captured strange movements, but never anything concrete enough to take to the police again. A week after moving in, I decided to thoroughly search the basement myself. The previous owners had left some old shelving units against the walls, and behind one, I noticed the concrete looked different, newer somehow. I pulled the shelf away and found a small door, about 3 feet high, sealed with caulk around the edges. My heart pounded as I used a utility knife to cut through the caulk. The small door opened with a groan, revealing a narrow crawl space. The beam of my flashlight illuminated dirt walls reinforced with wooden beams, leading deeper under the house. I should have called the police immediately. Instead, driven by some morbid curiosity, I squeezed myself into the opening and began to crawl forward. The tunnel extended about 15 feet before branching in two directions. One path seemed to lead toward the front of the house, the other toward the back. The air was stale and thick with dust. As I moved forward, my flashlight beam caught something shiny on the ground. A gum wrapper, new enough that the foil still reflected brightly. Further along, I found a small stockpile. Several bottles of water, some canned food, a battery-powered lantern, and a worn blanket. Someone had been living in my walls. I backed out quickly, called 911, and waited on my front porch until the police arrived. This time, they took me seriously. They brought in more officers, including some with K-9 units. They discovered the tunnel system extended not just under my house but beyond it, with exits in the woods behind my property. The investigation revealed disturbing details. Based on the items found in the tunnels, some receipts, food wrappers, a prepaid phone, someone had been living there for at least 7 months, well before I purchased the house. They found a crudely made peephole into my bedroom and another into the bathroom. Most disturbing of all, they found a small collection of items that belonged to me. A sock, a receipt from my wallet, and several strands of my hair. They never caught whoever it was. The tunnels connected to a drainage system that offered multiple escape routes. The police said it was likely a squatter, possibly homeless, who had discovered the old root cellar entrance and expanded it over time. I listed the house for sale the next day. While waiting for a buyer, I stayed with a friend in the city. I returned only once more, accompanied by 2 police officers, to collect the last of my belongings. As we were leaving, one of the officers pointed out something I hadn't noticed before. Crude scratches on the inside of the basement door frame, too high to be seen unless you were looking for them. Tallies, hundreds of them, and below them, barely legible, for words, "Watching you like the others." The house sold for far less than I paid, to an investment company that planned to renovate and flip it. I didn't tell them about the tunnels. The police report was public record if they bothered to check. Sometimes I still wake up at night, thinking I hear footsteps. I live in a high-rise apartment now, security on every floor. But I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that whoever lived in my walls followed me here. Last week, I thought I saw someone familiar at the grocery store. A thin, pale man who seemed to be wearing clothes a size too big. He was watching me from the end of an aisle, but when I looked directly at him, he disappeared. Probably just my imagination. After all, I never saw the face of the person who lived beneath my floor. But they saw mine. Every day, every night. Still watching. Story 2: The Night Shift. I've always preferred night shifts. There's something about the quiet, the soft beeping of monitors, and the dimmed hallway lights that feels more peaceful than the chaotic bustle of daytime hospital hours. Most nurses hate pulling nights in the geriatric ward, but I actually volunteered for them. The elderly patients sleep more, which means less running around for me, and the ones who stay awake usually have the most fascinating stories to tell. At least, that's how I justified it when I first started. Now I know I was just witnessing the beginning of something terrible. It started 3 months into my position at Lakeside Community Hospital, a small 50-bed facility in a town so tiny it barely registered on maps. The geriatric ward occupied the entire east wing of the second floor, 14 rooms total, usually at about 80% capacity. Room 211 was at the end of the hall, directly across from the nurse's station. Mrs. Abernathy had been there for nearly a month recovering from a broken hip. She was sharp as a tack despite being 87, which is why I took notice when she started talking about the tall man. "He stands in my doorway at night," she told me while I was checking her vitals. "Just watches me. Doesn't say anything." I assumed it was a dream or perhaps early signs of sundowning, common in elderly patients during hospital stays. I made a note in her chart and didn't think much more about it. 3 nights later, Mr. Winters in room 209 mentioned seeing someone standing in his doorway around 3 a.m. Tall fellow, thin, wearing what looked like scrubs. Thought it was a doctor, but he never came in. Just watched me for a while, then left. When Mrs. Keller in room 207 described the same figure a week later, I started paying more attention. 3 different patients, none with cognitive impairments, all describing the same visitor who never actually entered their rooms. I asked Jade, the other night nurse, if she'd seen anyone unusual on our floor. Just the regular night staff, she said with a shrug. Sometimes Dr. Lawson comes up if there's an emergency, but that's rare. Dr. Lawson was in his 60s, short and stout, nothing like the tall, thin figure my patients described. Curious, I began looking through old patient files during my breaks. I wasn't searching for anything specific at first, just patterns. I noticed room 211 had an unusually high turnover rate. Patients would be placed there and within weeks would either decline rapidly or, in 6 cases over the past 2 years, pass away unexpectedly. The medical explanations all made sense individually. Cardiac arrest, stroke, respiratory failure, common enough in elderly patients. But the frequency seemed off. I dug deeper, going back 5 years, and found the pattern held. Room 211 had almost twice the mortality rate of any other room on the floor. Patients who had been stable would suddenly deteriorate without clear cause. When I mentioned this to my supervisor, Nurse Harriet Reed, she dismissed my concerns. Elderly patients die, Valencia. It's the natural order of things. Besides, someone has to be in that room. Her response felt rehearsed, like she'd had this conversation before. That night, I decided to stay after my shift ended at 7 a.m. I told the day nurse I had paperwork to finish and hid in the supply closet across from room 211, leaving the door cracked open just enough to see the hallway. Nothing happened for nearly 2 hours. I was fighting to stay awake when I saw Nurse Reed walk purposefully down the hallway. She wasn't scheduled for that day. She slipped into room 211, where Mrs. Abernathy was now sleeping. I expected her to come out quickly. Maybe she was just checking on her. But 10 minutes passed. When she finally emerged, she was carrying something small in her palm that she quickly pocketed. She looked both ways down the hall before heading toward the medication room. I followed at a distance and watched as she keyed in the access code. Through the small window in the door, I could see her disposing of something in the Sharps container, then meticulously recording something in the medication log. That evening, I came in early for my shift and checked Mrs. Abernathy's chart. Her condition had unexpectedly worsened. She was now on increased pain medication. When I went to check on her, her eyes were glassy, her breathing shallow. "The tall man was back," she whispered when I leaned in close. "He brought the quiet lady with him this time." A chill ran down my spine. I adjusted her blanket and promised to check on her frequently through the night. During my break, I accessed the hospital's maintenance records through a computer terminal that hadn't been properly logged out. I searched for any issues reported in room 211 over the years. There were dozens of entries. Unexplained equipment malfunctions, call button failures, monitor glitches, all in that one room. All quickly resolved without explanation. I also noticed our security cameras had a pattern of technical issues during certain night shifts. Always when Nurse Reed was on duty. The footage would go dark for exactly 22 minutes, between 3:08 and 3:30 a.m. My shift that night was with Devin, a new nurse who had transferred from the ER. Around 2:45 a.m., I made an excuse to check on another patient and instead positioned myself in the same supply closet. At exactly 3:06 a.m., Nurse Reed appeared. She wasn't scheduled to work that night. She walked directly to room 211. Through the crack in the door, I could see her remove something from her pocket, a small vial and syringe. She injected the contents directly into Mrs. Abernathy's foreline, then stood watching for several minutes. She didn't record anything in the chart or log the medication. I had seen enough. I quietly made my way to the security office on the first floor, where night guard Paul was usually half asleep in front of the monitors. "Paul, I need to see the feed from the second floor, East Wing, right now," I said. He looked startled. "That camera's been glitchy. Just went dark again about 10 minutes ago." "Call the police," I said firmly. Tell them we have someone administering unauthorized medication to patients. Everything happened quickly after that. The police arrived within minutes. They caught Nurse Reed in the medication room, where she was replacing the vial she had used. Her pocket contained 5 more similar vials, a powerful mixture of morphine and other drugs that, in her words, eased the transition. The investigation revealed she had been doing this for 7 years. Her journal, found in her locker, documented 31 releases, as she called them. She had created a system where certain patients, those she deemed to be suffering too much or ready to move on, would be placed in room 211. She would then help them find peace during unscheduled visits in the early morning hours. The tall man my patients had described wasn't real, at least not in the conventional sense. Several patients who survived their stay in room 211 later revealed they had seen this figure standing in their doorway right before Nurse Reed would appear. Some psychologists suggested it was a stress-induced hallucination, their minds trying to warn them of approaching danger. Others in the hospital believed something more supernatural was at work, that room 211 had become a threshold of sorts, where those close to death could glimpse whatever waited on the other side. Mrs. Abernathy survived. The toxicology screen showed she'd received only a partial dose of Nurse Reed's lethal mixture. When she recovered enough to speak clearly, she told me, "The tall man saved me. He stood between me and the quiet lady. He pushed her away." Nurse Reed was convicted of 31 counts of murder and is serving multiple life sentences. The hospital implemented strict medication protocols and installed a new security system with no blind spots or convenient glitches. I still work the night shift, but at a different hospital in another state. I requested a position in the geriatric ward again. Someone needs to watch over them, to listen when they talk about strange figures standing in doorways. Because sometimes those visions aren't confusion or dementia. Sometimes they're warnings. Every night when I make my rounds, I find myself looking for a tall, thin figure at the end of the hallway. I haven't seen him yet, but sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I catch a glimpse of something, someone, watching over my patients, and I'm oddly comforted by it. Story 3 # The Hitchhiker. I've been driving the same Nevada highway for 12 years now. Las Vegas to Reno, Reno to Vegas, sometimes a detour to Salt Lake or Phoenix. The loneliness doesn't bother me anymore. It's part of the job, part of who I am. That night, it was pouring like I'd never seen in the desert. The kind of flash storm that turns dry creek beds into raging rivers in minutes. My wipers couldn't keep up, and I was considering pulling over when I spotted her. A woman standing on the shoulder, drenched, her arm weakly extended in the universal hitchhiker's gesture. I shouldn't have stopped. Every trucking company has strict policies against picking up hitchhikers. But something about the desperation in her posture, the way she hunched against the rain, it didn't sit right with me to leave her out there. I slowed the rig and pulled onto the shoulder about 20 feet ahead of her. Through my side mirror, I watched her run toward the truck, her movements strangely uneven, like she was favoring one leg. When she climbed into the cab, water pooled around her feet. She was shivering violently. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible over the drumming rain. "I thought no one would stop." "Where you headed?" I asked, already pulling back onto the highway. She didn't answer immediately, and when I glanced over, she seemed confused. Her hair was plastered to her pale face, and her eyes, there was something off about them. Too wide, maybe, or too dark. "I need to get home," she finally said. "But I can't. I can't remember where that is exactly." Great. I'd picked up someone who was either on something or not right in the head. But I couldn't just put her back out in the storm. "I'm Darius," I said. "I'm heading to Reno. I can take you that far if it helps." "Lorelei," she replied. I think Reno might be right." Her voice had an unusual quality, like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. We drove in silence for a while. The rain eventually let up, and a full moon broke through the clouds, casting an eerie silver light across the empty desert landscape. The dashboard clock read 2:17 a.m. "This song," Lorelei suddenly said, turning her head toward the radio. "I know this song. The weird thing was the radio wasn't on. I hadn't been playing any music. "There's no song playing," I said carefully. She looked at me strangely, then smiled. "You don't hear it? It's my mother's favorite." She began to hum a tune I didn't recognize. The cab temperature seemed to drop about 10 degrees. I cranked up the heat, trying to shake the chill crawling up my spine. "You cold?" I asked. "I don't feel it anymore," she answered. That's when the truck's electrical system went haywire. The headlights flickered, the dashboard lit up with warning indicators, and the radio suddenly turned on by itself, scanning rapidly through frequencies before stopping on static. Through the static, I could barely make out what sounded like a woman's voice, singing the same melody Lorelei had been humming. "She's calling me," Lorelei whispered, staring at the radio. I tried to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. The static grew louder until it was almost painful. Then, just as suddenly, everything returned to normal. The headlights stabilized, the dashboard cleared, and the radio went silent. "What the hell was that?" I muttered, my heart racing. Lorelei didn't respond. When I glanced over, she was staring straight ahead, her profile sharper somehow than it had been minutes before. Her hair seemed drier, longer. "My boyfriend is waiting for me," she said, still not looking at me. "He doesn't know what happened." "What did happen?" I asked, unable to stop myself. The truck came out of nowhere. 1 minute I was driving, singing along to the radio, and the next, she trailed off, her hand moving to her side where I noticed a dark stain on her blouse I hadn't seen before. The next minute, I was walking in the rain. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to keep my voice steady. "When was this? What day is it?" she asked. "Thursday, March 3rd. She frowned. "I left Phoenix on Monday night. 3 days. She'd been wandering the desert for 3 days? That didn't make sense. No one survives in the open Nevada desert for 3 days without water, especially not after an accident. "We should get you to a hospital," I suggested. "No." The vehemence in her voice startled me. "No hospitals. Just take me home. Kai is waiting." "Kai is your boyfriend?" She nodded, then looked at me with an unsettling intensity. "You have a daughter, don't you, Darius? She has your eyes." The hairs on my arms stood up. I'd never mentioned my daughter. There were no photos of Zoe in the cab, nothing to indicate I was a father. "How did you know that?" Lorelei's expression softened. "You look like a father. You have kind eyes." She paused. "She forgives you, by the way." My blood ran cold. Zoe and I had fought before this trip, a stupid argument about her college plans. It was the reason I'd taken this last-minute haul, to give us both some space. "You couldn't have known that," I said, my voice hoarse. Lorelei didn't respond, just returned to staring out the windshield. We were approaching a small town. Really just a gas station, diner, and motel clustered around an intersection. I needed to stop, to clear my head, maybe to get this increasingly disturbing woman out of my truck. As I pulled into the gas station, a sheriff's cruiser was parked outside the attached convenience store. The sight of it brought both relief and apprehension. "I'm going to fill up," I told Lorelei. "You want anything from inside?" She shook her head, still not looking at me. The sheriff was at the counter when I entered. He nodded at me, the universal acknowledgement between strangers in small towns. I grabbed a coffee and some aspirin, my head pounding. As I was paying, the small TV behind the counter caught my attention. A news report showed a photo of a wrecked car in the desert. And then a driver's license photo appeared on screen. It was Lorelei. The cashier noticed my expression. "Terrible thing," he said. "Young woman ran off the road during Monday's storm. They just found her car yesterday, about 50 miles east of here." The sheriff turned toward me. "You all right, partner? You look like you've seen a ghost." "That woman," I pointed at the screen. "When did they find her?" "The driver." The sheriff frowned. "They found her body still in the car. Been there for days. Real sad." She was only 26. I stumbled back to my truck, legs barely supporting me. The passenger seat was empty. No puddle on the floor. No sign anyone had been there at all. With shaking hands, I checked my phone. There was a new photo album I didn't remember creating, titled simply Lorelei. Inside were dozens of photos of an empty passenger seat, the Nevada desert at night, and in one, just one, the blurry outline of a woman's profile, her features distorted, her eyes black holes in a too pale face. I deleted them all, changed my route, and drove straight through to Reno without stopping. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, my radio turns on by itself, scanning through stations until it finds static. And through the static, I swear I can hear her humming. Story 4: The Thing in the Crawl Space. I moved into the house in late September, just as the first crisp winds of autumn rolled in. It was an old rental, cheap, creaky, and slightly outdated, but I didn't mind. It had charm, a little history, and most importantly, it was within my budget. I had my dog, Ragnar, a big, lazy Malamute who never barked at anything, and I figured we'd settle in just fine. The first couple of nights were uneventful. The usual sounds of an aging house, wood groaning, pipes humming, the occasional tap of something settling. But around the third night, I started hearing something else. Faint shuffling. At first, I thought it was just Ragnar moving in his sleep, but then I noticed him too. Ears perked, body stiff, staring at the floorboards near the kitchen. His fur bristled, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. That should have been my first sign to pack my bags. But I didn't. Instead, I did what any idiot in a horror story would do. I ignored it. Over the next few nights, the noises got worse. A light scratching sound, as if nails were dragging along wood, always beneath the floor. It was faint, almost hesitant. The kind of sound that, if you weren't paying attention, you could dismiss as imagination. But I was paying attention. One night, as I sat on my couch watching TV, I heard a distinct tap-tap-tap coming from below the floorboards. I muted the TV, held my breath, and listened. Silence. Then tap, tap, tap. Ragnar, who had been dozing by my feet, shot up and let out a deep, guttural snarl. His eyes were locked on a specific spot near the hallway, his body tense. My stomach twisted. I grabbed a flashlight and hesitantly approached the area he was staring at. The floor looked normal, no loose boards, no gaps. But when I crouched down and knocked my knuckles against the wood, it sounded hollow. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I called my landlord, a grumpy old guy named Mr. Hargrove, and asked if the house had a crawl space. He grumbled something about an access panel in the laundry room and told me not to go messing around down there. So, of course, I did. The access panel was small, barely 2 feet wide, hidden behind a shelf. I had to pry it open with a screwdriver, and when I did, a wave of cold, stale air rushed out. It smelled damp, old. Shining my flashlight inside, I saw nothing but dirt and cobwebs at first. The space was barely tall enough to crawl through, and the beams above were lined with old insulation. I was about to close it back up when my light caught something in the far corner. Something that shouldn't have been there. A small, filthy blanket. And next to it, a pile of empty food wrappers. I felt my breath hitch. My skin crawled. Someone had been living down there. I backed away and slammed the panel shut. That night, I triple-checked my locks. Ragnar stuck close to me, his usual lazy demeanor replaced with something uneasy. He paced a lot, sniffing at the floor, whining. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to him growling, deep, menacing. I jolted upright and listened, scratching. But this time it wasn't faint. It was directly beneath me. I froze. Then came a sound that made my stomach turn to ice. A single, slow knock, right under my bed. I don't remember how long I stayed like that, gripping the sheets, my pulse hammering in my ears. But at some point, the noises stopped. The silence felt worse. At dawn, I made up my mind. I had to see if anything had changed in the crawl space. Heart pounding, I opened the panel again and shined my flashlight inside. The blanket was still there. The wrappers. But now there was something new. Polaroid photo. I picked it up with trembling hands and flipped it over. My stomach lurched. It was a picture of me, sleeping, taken from inside my room. I scrambled back, nearly tripping over myself. My head was spinning. Someone had been inside my house, watching me. I called the police immediately. When they arrived, they searched the crawlspace, but whoever had been there was already gone. They found a few more things: a dirty pillow, an old sweatshirt, footprints in the dust. But no sign of the person. The worst part? The police said the access panel locked from the inside. I left that house the same day, packed what I could, grabbed Ragnar, and never looked back. A few weeks later, I got a call from the landlord. He seemed irritated, mostly because the police had torn up the crawlspace during their search. But then he asked something that made my blood run cold. "You said you heard noises under the floor?" he grumbled. "That don't make sense. There ain't supposed to be a crawlspace under the bedrooms, just under the kitchen and laundry." I felt sick, because that meant that whatever had been under my bed that night, it wasn't supposed to be there. Story 5: The Passenger Who Never Left. I've been driving for rideshare services for a few years now, and I've seen all sorts of characters. But nothing prepared me for the night I picked up Celine. It was a stormy evening, a relentless downpour that blurred the city lights into a watercolor smear on the windshield. I was on my usual route, shuttling passengers across town, when the app buzzed with a new ride request. The pickup location was in a dimly lit part of town, far from the bustling center. I pulled up and saw her standing under a flickering street lamp. She was a petite woman with long, dark hair that clung to her face from the rain, and her expression was calm, almost eerily serene. I opened the door, and she slipped into the back seat without a word. Celine, the app said, was her name. I offered a friendly, "Where to tonight?" But she simply nodded toward the front, her eyes never meeting mine. As I started the car, I couldn't help but notice her silence. A silence so complete it almost swallowed the hum of the engine and the sound of the rain against the roof. I asked casually, "Rough night out there?" But she only gave a slight tilt of her head, as if I had asked a question too obvious to answer. The address she provided was a rural one, miles away from the city's bright lights. As I drove through the soaking streets, I stole glances in the rearview mirror. In the reflection, I saw her lips moving slowly, as if she was conversing with someone or something unseen. It was subtle at first, but then it became undeniable. Every few minutes, without fail, her mouth would twitch and move as if reciting words meant only for the dark. The roads grew lonelier as we ventured further away from the city. The windshield wipers struggled against the heavy rain, and the trees on either side of the road whipped past in a blurred frenzy. I tried to start a conversation. "You all right back there?" But again, she only responded with a soft, almost inaudible murmur that I couldn't quite catch. I chalked it up to the rain and my overactive imagination. After all, in a storm, it's easy to think the world is playing tricks on you. Minutes later, the address came into view. A dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town, half hidden by overgrown weeds and the shadows of ancient trees. I pulled up, the tires splashing through puddles as I parked by the curb. I glanced back at the back seat. Celine was still there, her gaze fixed on something outside the window. I turned to her and said, "Here we are." But as I looked into the back seat, she was gone. The seat was empty, save for a damp imprint on the headrest that resembled the curve of her neck. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Had I imagined her entire presence? I forced myself to believe I was just exhausted from the long drive and the relentless rain. Before I could gather my thoughts, the front passenger door swung open. I turned and found an elderly man standing on the porch, his eyes sharp beneath a heavy brow and his voice raspy as he said, "You dropped your passenger off." I was confused. "I didn't see anyone leave," I replied, trying to mask the growing unease in my voice. The old man smiled, but there was something hollow about it. "She always finds her way home," he murmured, as if reciting a line from a well-worn ghost story. I frowned. "What do you mean?" He leaned on his cane, his eyes locking with mine as he said, "Celine died about 10 years ago. She was out on that same road, trying to get home when her car skidded off the road during a storm. Ever since, folks say she rides with kind strangers, silently seeking the one last ride." My heart pounded in my chest as I recalled the strange behavior in the car, the silent murmurs, the uncanny movement of her lips. I remembered the eerie calmness in her eyes, as if she knew something I didn't. I stood there in the cold rain, my mind reeling, trying to comprehend what I had just witnessed. The old man's words reverberated in my ears. I stepped out of the car and walked over, my steps hesitant on the wet gravel. "Are you saying she's a ghost?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the sound of the storm. The man nodded solemnly, a spirit lost between worlds, always longing for the comfort of home. "Some nights, she appears in rides like yours, seeking that final journey." I looked back at my car, half expecting to see her sitting there, a spectral figure in the rearview mirror. But the back seat remained empty, its silence as haunting as ever. I thanked the old man and, with trembling hands, locked the car. I didn't drive away immediately. I just stood there, the cold rain mixing with the chill of realization that I had encountered something beyond explanation. The remainder of the night passed in a blur. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her apparition lingering near the road, waiting for another ride. The image of her, silent and somber, stayed with me long after I returned to the city. Even now, on nights when the rain begins to fall and the wind carries whispers of the past, I can't help but wonder if she's still out there, silently seeking her final ride home. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of a pale figure in the corner of my eye when the city lights dimmed, or the gentle sound of whispered words that I couldn't quite decipher. Every time I heard a knock at the door, my heart would skip a beat, half expecting Celine to appear, as real and haunting as she had on that rainy night. I know what I experienced might sound like the ramblings of an overactive imagination or the consequence of long hours on the road during stormy nights. But the memory is etched in my mind, vivid and undeniable. The passenger who never left wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was a silent reminder that some souls remain tethered to the world, seeking solace, redemption, or simply the comfort of one last ride. Now, whenever I start my car and see the rearview mirror, I can't help but glance at it, half expecting to see that same soft figure, sitting silently, watching me drive into the night. And though I've since taken a break from rideshare driving, the memory of that stormy night lingers, a ghostly presence that I can neither forget nor explain. Story 6: The Smiling Man in the Woods. Hiking has always been my escape. The solitude, the quiet rustle of the trees, the scent of damp earth. It clears my mind in a way nothing else does. That's why, last fall, I decided to take a solo trip to the mountains for the weekend. Just me, my backpack, and miles of untouched wilderness. I picked a remote trail in the Olympic National Forest, one I'd read about but never attempted. It wasn't too difficult, and there were designated campsites along the way. I figured I'd hike up to a spot with a view, set up camp, and spend the night under the stars. I never should have gone alone. The first few hours were peaceful. I moved at a steady pace, listening to the crunch of leaves under my boots and the distant chirps of birds overhead. I passed a few hikers on their way down, exchanged friendly nods, but by late afternoon, I hadn't seen another soul in hours. That was fine by me. I came for the solitude. I was about 4 miles in when I saw him. He was standing at the treeline, about 30 feet off the trail. A man, tall and thin, dressed in a plain blue jacket and dark pants. His clothes looked clean, almost too clean for someone out in the woods. But what struck me most was his face. He was smiling, not a friendly smile, not an absent-minded one. No, his grin was wide, forced, and unnervingly frozen. His eyes, shadowed beneath the low branches, were locked on me. I stopped in my tracks. "Hey there," I called out, forcing a casual tone. Maybe he was a fellow hiker, a little odd but harmless. He didn't respond, didn't move, didn't blink. I felt a prickle of unease creep up my spine. "All right then," I muttered, more to myself than to him, and picked up my pace. I kept my eyes forward, resisting the urge to glance back. After about 5 minutes, my nerves settled. It was just some weirdo, probably trying to freak me out. People did dumb things in the woods. Kids messing around. Maybe some local creep. I told myself it was nothing. Then I saw him again. I don't know how he got ahead of me. There was no way, no possible way. He could have moved faster than me through the dense underbrush. Yet there he was, standing just beyond the next bend, closer than before. Still smiling. My breath hitched. Every instinct in my body screamed, turn around. Leave, go back. But pride is a stupid thing. I told myself I was being paranoid. That maybe I just imagined seeing him earlier. That this was just some weird coincidence. So I kept walking. But now my pace was quicker. My hands gripped the straps of my backpack, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. I refused to look at him as I passed. I should have turned back right then. I should have. By the time I reached my campsite, the sky had dimmed to a dusky purple. I set up my tent in record time, my mind racing with what I'd seen. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Just the quiet rustling of the wind. Maybe I'd been overreacting. Maybe the guy had just been passing through. I built a small fire and forced myself to eat a granola bar, but my appetite was gone. The forest felt too quiet. No distant owls, no chirping crickets. Just silence. I decided to turn in early. Crawling into my sleeping bag, I left my knife beside me, just in case. The tent walls felt flimsy, too thin. But exhaustion took over, and eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep. Then I heard whispers. The whispering man. I woke up in the middle of the night, my body stiff, my breath shallow. I didn't move. Outside my tent, something was whispering. The voice was low, barely audible gibberish murmurs. Words I couldn't make out. It came from just outside, inches from the thin fabric of my tent wall. I didn't breathe. The whispering continued, slow and deliberate. My fingers inched toward my knife. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, knife clutched in my hand, staring at the tent wall. At some point, exhaustion won and I passed out again. Morning came too slowly. When I unzipped my tent, I half expected to see him standing there. But the woods were empty. The only sign that something had been there was the circle of footprints around my campsite. Bare footprints. I packed my things in record time and practically ran back down the trail. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf sent my heart into my throat. I didn't see him again, but I could feel him, watching. The note. I made it back to my car by noon, panting, sweating, my nerves frayed. As I threw my backpack into the trunk, I saw something tucked under my windshield wiper. A note. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were 3 words. I'll see you. Not I'll see you soon. Not I'll see you again. Just I'll see you. I haven't been hiking alone since. Story 7. My brother's reflection wasn't his. My brother, Elias, has always been different. Not in a bad way. Just quieter than most kids. Always lost in his own world. As the older sibling, I looked out for him. Our parents worked late, so it was mostly just the 2 of us in that big old house we grew up in. For the most part, things were normal. Until they weren't. Until Elias stopped being Elias. It began with small things. Elias would stare at his reflection a little too long, his eyes unfocused, like he was trying to listen to something just out of reach. At first, I chalked it up to normal kid behavior. He was 12, at that awkward age where you start becoming self-conscious. But it wasn't just normal staring. He would do it for hours. I'd find him standing in front of the bathroom mirror, the room completely dark, just watching himself. Sometimes his lips moved, but no words came out. Hey, Elias, I'd say, nudging him. You good? He'd blink, shake his head like snapping out of a trance, and mumble, yeah, just thinking. It was weird, but I let it go. Then it got worse. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but as my mind cleared, I realized it was real low, hushed voices coming from the hallway. I pushed off my blanket and stepped out of my room. The whispering was coming from the bathroom. The door was cracked open, just enough to let a sliver of light spill into the hallway. "Elias!" I called. No response. I crept closer, my stomach twisting. Through the gap in the door, I could see him standing in front of the mirror. He wasn't alone. I swear to God, there were two of him. One was inside the mirror. It wasn't just a reflection. The Elias in the mirror was moving wrong. His head tilted slightly, his smile too wide, his eyes too dark. The real Elias just stood there, his lips moving in that silent way he always did. Then, suddenly, his reflection snapped its head toward me. Not Elias, just the reflection. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. Elias turned around slowly, blinking at me like he had just woken up. "Zane?" His voice was groggy. "What's wrong?" I looked past him at the mirror. It was normal again, just a regular reflection. "And nothing," I stammered. "Go to bed, man." He nodded and shuffled past me, rubbing his eyes. I stood there for a long time, staring at my own reflection, half expecting it to move without me. Didn't. But I didn't sleep that night. I started watching Elias more closely after that. He barely spoke at school, barely ate at dinner. He was always tired. Dark circles formed under his eyes, and his skin got paler by the day. One afternoon, I came home early and found him in our parents' room. He was standing in front of their full-length mirror, completely still. "Elias!" He didn't turn. I stepped closer. His hands were shaking. "Dude, what are you doing?" "I think it wants to come out," he whispered. A chill ran down my spine. "What?" He swallowed hard, eyes locked on his own reflection. "It talks to me. It knows things. It says I'm not supposed to be here." My blood turned to ice. "What the hell does that mean?" He finally turned to look at me, and for a split second I swore to God his eyes were wrong. Too black, too deep. Then he blinked, and they were normal again. "I'm just tired," he mumbled. "Sorry." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him, but I didn't. The last time it happened, I saw it clearly. It was a Sunday night, and Elias had barely spoken all day. I heard him shuffling around in his room, but I left him alone. Around midnight, I got up to get some water. As I passed his door, I noticed it was open. He wasn't in bed. I felt it before I saw it. That cold, suffocating presence. I turned toward the bathroom. The door was wide open, the light flickering slightly. And there he was. Elias stood in front of the mirror, but his reflection wasn't right. His real body was still, too still, like he wasn't even breathing. But the Elias in the mirror? It was smiling. Not a normal smile, not even a sinister one. It was amused, like it had one. The room felt wrong, like the air had been sucked out. My vision blurred at the edges. My legs felt heavy. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was frozen. Then Elias moved. Not his reflection. Him. Slowly he turned his head toward me. His face was blank, emotionless. But the mirror Elias? It didn't turn. It just kept staring at me, smiling. That broke whatever trance I was in. I grabbed Elias by the arm and yanked him back. He let out a gasp, like I had just pulled him from deep water. The light flickered again, and the reflection moved normally. I dragged him out of the bathroom, slammed the door, and held him by the shoulders. "What the hell is going on, Elias?" His eyes welled up with tears. "I don't know," he whispered, "but I think it's not me anymore." The next morning, Elias was gone. Not just missing, gone. His bed was neatly made. His shoes were still by the door. The only thing out of place was the bathroom mirror. It was shattered. We called the police. My parents panicked. Search parties were formed. But no one found him. No footprints. No signs of struggle. It was like he had just vanished. For weeks, I refused to look in any mirrors. When I finally did, I almost expected to see him there. Or worse, something else. It's been years now. My parents gave up hope, but I never did. I still dream about that night. And sometimes, when I pass by a mirror in a dark room, I swear I see him, still smiling. Story 8: The Man Who Dug Graves at Night. When I was 16, I worked part-time at a cemetery. It wasn't as bad as you'd think. The pay was decent, and it was usually quiet, just mowing grass, clearing leaves, basic upkeep. But there was one rule my boss, Mr. Lawton, drilled into me from the start. Never stay past sundown. I thought he was just superstitious. Small-town folks have weird beliefs, and I figured this was one of them. So I followed the rule. Until one night I didn't, and I met him, the man who dug graves at night. It was early October, and the sun was setting earlier each day. I lost track of time while trimming hedges near the older part of the cemetery, where the tombstones were worn and crooked, some dating back to the 1800s. By the time I checked my phone, the sun was already dipping below the trees. I cursed under my breath and grabbed my things, hurrying toward the gate. That's when I saw him. A man, dressed in tattered overalls and a filthy coat, stood near an open grave. He was digging slow, methodical movements, the scrape of his shovel cutting through the silence. I stopped. My first thought was that he was another worker, but that didn't make sense. No one was supposed to be here this late. "Hey!" I called out. "You work here?" The digging stopped. For a long moment he just stood there, his back to me, unmoving. Then, without turning, he plunged the shovel back into the dirt and kept digging. I felt something, a cold, crawling sensation under my skin. I don't know why, but every instinct screamed at me to leave. I hurried to my car, heart pounding. As I fumbled with my keys, I glanced back toward the grave. The man was gone, but the hole? It was still there, and it was deeper. The next day, I told Mr. Lawton about the man. His face went pale. "You didn't talk to him, did you?" "No," I said, shifting uncomfortably. "Why?" He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "Listen to me, Rowan. If you ever see him again, you leave. Immediately. Don't speak to him. Don't look at what he's doing." "Who is he?" Mr. Lawton hesitated. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "He's been here longer than me, longer than anyone." I didn't ask any more questions, but I started noticing things. Some mornings, I'd find freshly dug graves that weren't on our records. Graves without headstones. The dirt would be loose, the grass disturbed, but by the next day, it would look untouched, like the earth had settled too fast, like something had been buried in a hurry. I tried not to think about it, but a part of me couldn't let it go. One evening, just before closing, I stayed later than I should have. Not by accident this time. I wanted to see him again, and I did. He was in the same spot near the oldest graves, digging with slow, deliberate movements. I hid behind a tree and watched. After a while, he climbed out of the grave, brushing dirt from his coat. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, something wrapped in cloth. He bent down and placed it in the hole. Then he covered it up. I held my breath, my mind racing. What was he burying? A box? Ashes? Something worse? I shifted slightly, and a twig snapped beneath my boot. His head snapped up, and for the first time he turned toward me. I'll never forget his face. It wasn't old, like I expected. He looked wrong, like someone had stretched too tight skin over a skull that didn't quite fit. His eyes were deep, sunken pits, and when he smiled, God, that smile. His teeth were black and rotting. He took a step forward. I ran. I didn't stop until I was inside my car, doors locked, engine roaring. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cemetery was empty, but the grave, it was gone, like it had never been there at all. I quit 2 days later. I told Mr. Lawton I couldn't work there anymore. He didn't argue. As I packed up my locker, I overheard 2 groundskeepers talking in hushed voices. "Another one," one muttered. "Yeah, no record of them either." I turned. "Another what?" They looked at each other, then at me. "A grave," the older man said. "Another unmarked one. Freshly dug. Then gone the next day." I felt sick. "How often does that happen?" He hesitated. Then, quietly, "Too often." I left and never went back. Years later, I visited my hometown. Curiosity got the better of me, and I drove past the old cemetery. It looked the same, peaceful, normal. But as I slowed down, my eyes flicked toward the tree line. And there, standing just beyond the graves, was him. He was watching me, not moving, not smiling, just waiting. I pressed the gas and never looked back. But I know this. He's still out there, still digging, still burying things that were never meant to be found.